I'm not leaving without it. Greetings, I'm Shad, and you might be able to guess, I really like enchanted swords. It's just the concept behind it, from classic Sword in the Stone through to Lord of the Rings, everything, right? And I've often wondered, how would they really work? What is the enchantment? Now, some enchantments are more straightforward. They could give you a physical enhancement or buff when you have the sword, or the sword would never lose its edge and stay sharp forever, and it can't be broken, which by the way is an awesome enchantment if it's super sharp already, right? And then there are really fancy enchantments like being sheathed in flame or something, which, I mean, would a flame sword actually give you real benefits? We've got a dedicated video testing real fire swords, by the way. And yeah, there's certain benefits that a fire sword would actually give, as to increased cutting capacity. Not really, but increased damage. Yeah, and intimidation is a bit. It's really interesting. Watch the video, you can find out. But more generally, the more base standard enchantment on swords is they can cut better than regular. That's interesting, because how would they actually cut better than a regular sword? And that's what I want to speculate. Would like a basic enchanted sword cut better than a regular one? Let's discuss this a little bit, because let's look at, say, the classic +1 sword, referring to role-playing games. D&D is famous. Let's pretend that this Baylor Arms 18C, Oakshot 18C, Alexandria sword, that's a mouthful. It's a great sword still. Let's pretend this sword was a +1 sword. How would that alter or affect its utility in real life? Because a +1 sword gets a bonus to both attack and damage. It is easier to strike your opponent with this sword, and it cuts better than a normal sword, hence the +1 damage. You wouldn't really get that benefit if the sword was just magically strengthened to the point where it can't be damaged by non-magical swords or lose its edge. Now, by the way, that utility comes with the base +1 enchantment. When you look at the descriptions, that a +1 sword can't be damaged by anything other than another +1 or greater enhanced sword, which means it's basically invulnerable to normal unenchanted weapons, which is huge. That's a flippin' amazing enchantment. I would take that, absolutely. Because it also means it would never lose its edge. But does that mean it would be inherently sharper than a non-enchanted sword? Not necessarily. It means that it would remain sharper far longer than all other regular swords, and you'll never de-sharpen it, which is an awesome enchantment, right? But you can sharpen up non-enchanted swords to insane razor-sharp levels, okay? As a result then, for the first few cuts before the sword starts to get blunted, it would actually cut just as well as that +1 sword. But people might say, but you get a +1 on masterwork swords. The +1 enchantment actually magically enhances how sharp the sword is, to reach a level of sharpness that is basically mechanically impossible to achieve with a regular grinding stone. That I could go with. That's interesting. That's actually pretty cool. Imagine if you could have a sword that had an edge thickness of like a molecule or even an atom. It was that insanely sharp. That would be gnarly. Like seriously, like that sword, I would just drool to be able to test cut a sword that had an edge that sharp. That would be crazy. And then, okay, I would absolutely acknowledge and grant that would increase the damage capacity of that sword if it had an edge that sharp. And that you never needed to sharpen it either, again, like because it's magically reinforced and only other magical swords can damage it. Awesome. Really cool. +1 swords suddenly are actually, like, if you had like a low magic setting, a +1 sword is essentially an invulnerable sword that never needs to get sharpened that is super insanely sharp. That is crazy cool. That's like just doing this would cut your finger. Like, this is a sharp sword, but like when you're familiar with sharp swords, you know, I guess, the pressure needed to really cut yourself, and you can still touch the edge and test the edge. This would be cutting me if it was like a molecule or atom thick. Like it would be insane. It would be insane, right? It would feel like a lightsaber. You would just never want to touch the edge no matter what, and you'd be really careful whenever you use this thing and be like, you know, keep it in its sheath. You don't want to just leave the blade around. And by the way, that's how you would adapt it into a story if you had a sword that insanely sharp, okay? Suddenly, the user would be far more delicate and wary about where this edge touched. If you had a sword that unbelievably sharp, does that mean it could cut through anything? No. No, it doesn't, because there's another limiting factor on how well a sword can cut, even if it had the sharpest possible edge that is possible according to the laws of physics, a single atom thick, okay? You're still dealing with the width of the blade. Depending on the density of the material you're cutting into, the swords can literally get wedged in the target and stop. That's why they don't cut through any thickness of wood. As soon as the wood gets too thick, that it's not necessarily about how easy the edge is shearing apart the material. It's about the material not wanting to be pushed apart because it's being held together by the rest of the meat that you got to cut through, basically. And as a result, the sword literally gets wedged and stopped because the sword gets thicker as it travels into. And so that material limitation should be kept in mind with enchanted swords. In actual fact, the idea of a sword that can chop through anything is almost like, just if you're dealing with the base mechanics and geometry of standard swords, even with the sharpest sword possible, right? It's impossible to have a sword that could chop through anything. And this is the same with super impervious materials like adamantium, Wolverine's claws, or Valyrian steel, or any of these magical steels, right? It would still get wedged in a lot of different targets, to the point where this super crazy sharp edge that you don't even want to touch because you will cut yourself with any contact on the blade, still wouldn't be able to chop through a tree branch of, say, this thickness. Because it's so sharp, right, you would need less force to cut deeper, and so your cuts would get much deeper than other, you know, less sharp swords. And depending on how strongly the material kind of holds its structure as you cut in, will also have an effect. If the material just naturally flows apart like flesh, okay, I can't really see you running into any problems cutting through that material with the sharpest sword that can possibly get in physics, okay? And so there's a lot of materials that it could sail through like it wasn't even there. And I think the general thicknesses of bone and people is probably within those realms. And so you could easily you would be slicing people in half with a +1 sword if it did get that sharp really easily, to the level that, depending on how much of a sharpness enhancement the enchantment gives, that +1 to damage probably doesn't really acknowledge or demonstrate the insane level of damage and cutting ability a super sharp sword with no other enchantment. It's just super sharp and it won't lose that edge. The insane level of damage you could achieve with a super sharp sword. Like I said, you would sail through a person pretty easily with not that much force needed. But as soon as you hit denser material, that's where you got a problem. Could this hypothetical +1 super sharp sword chop through steel? It could chop into it. But steel, because it has such structure, that wedging effect would happen much, much sooner. I've seen, times when swords have chopped through really thin steel, and the only way it's able to do that is the steel is actually giving way and moving apart for the blade. As soon as you try and chop into any steel thing that has a certain level of structure to it, doesn't matter how sharp that sword is, even if it will never lose its edge and it's magically enhanced and stuff like that, it's going to get wedged and stopped. And so, even though I was saying this +1 enhanced sword would be insanely deadly, I actually think it wouldn't really get any additional benefit to get through well-made armor. And so that's a really interesting thing that if you wanted to be more realistic, you could adapt it into role-playing, but also your stories and everything like that, where this sword, it'll chop people in half like nothing, but it has as much trouble with armor as any other sword. Well-made armor. If the armor is thin, to the point where it can actually be forced apart by the wedging kind of, power of the strike, because the edge is magically enhanced and is not going to get blunted or everything like that. It's technically a harder material than the steel. And the harder material is able to cut into the softer material flat. That's how it works. So yeah, if you could avoid the wedging apart, you could chop through certain thicknesses of steel. But if it's properly made, well made, it's not gonna happen. And so I find that really interesting, that even this insanely deadly sword would be stopped in its tracks completely by metal armor. And so the idea of, all right, could we get a sword that can chop through anything? Well, you have to try and address something more significant. Sharpness is important, but that's only half of it. You need to figure out, how are you getting that material to move apart for the sword? If there is no magical enhancement to move apart that material for the sword, it's going to run into just as many problems if it was not enchanted. Interestingly enough, this is answered with science fiction type swords like lightsabers, because a lightsaber doesn't cut. In Star Wars lore, this is how they supposedly work, that they melt the material right through. And so it actually vaporizes like that level of material. This is why lightsabers, if they really existed, they don't accurately depict how they would work in the real world, because if it was so hot that it could vaporize your flesh, blood and liquid in your body. Have you ever seen like water dropped onto molten like steel or anything that is fully melted like lava? Drop a cube of ice onto it and see what happens. What you see is insanely violent gaseous expansion as that water or ice is vaporized into gas. And you basically get an explosion. And that's what would happen to a lightsaber. If a lightsaber actually hit a real person, you would make that person explode from their blood vaporizing and then expanding so rapidly. That would be insanely awful, messy weapons. And when I say, do lightsabers get that hot? Qui-Gon Jinn literally started to melt the blast door with one of these things. So yes, they're that hot. But if the mechanic behind it is still to actually remove the material that it's trying to pass through instead of separate it. This is the same as like how a chainsaw works. A chainsaw doesn't cut, it saws and removes. Oh, that's why you see all the flecks flying off. All right, that's the material literally getting gouged out to make room for the chainsaw blade. So, without addressing that mechanic, magical enhanced swords with super sharp edges and magical materials like even adamantium, it's essentially magic, right? No, it's not going to cut through thick steel. So how could we get a sword that cuts through anything? A magically enchanted sword that, whatever the material, steel, rock, it can just cut through it. Well, you kind of need to take an additional step to try and say that, well, the magical enhancement is doing something in addition. And this is something that I've done for another type of enchanted sword, not in a book I'm working on, but in a book that I've already published. And that is sun-forged blades like Imperius here. This is the version that is made by Calamisil. You can actually purchase it, they're available through Calamisil. And this is the sword of my main character, Dalen Namarin, also known as Daelis the Conqueror, and this is his famous and legendary sun-forged blade Imperius. So what is the mechanic that I have in my novel that feel free to use as inspiration for your own stories or role-playing games that enables swords like this to literally, in the fantasy world, chop through anything except other sun-forged blades. So what happens is, the process of enhancing these objects is called sun forging. The light in this universe is a type of magical energy that has supernatural effects, and there are magic users that can bond it to themselves. They're called light binders. They bond the light to their body, and it enhances aspects of the body. If you can bond that same light to an object, it enhances the purpose that that object was intended for. So this light is actually connected to how the very kind of universe works. So as a result, the universe will be warped and molded to accommodate this greater enhancement. Swords are meant to cut. That's their purpose. So when you sunforge a sword, the purpose is going to be enhanced that the very universe and reality will adapt to acknowledge it. And so what actually happens when a sunforged blade comes in contact with anything, the material literally moves apart for that blade. It's actually not necessarily a cutting effect, even though there is a very sharp edge on these blades. It's the reality warping effect of the sunforging process that is playing in effect, because this applies to all other objects that are sunforged. If you were to sunforge a rain cloak, a cloak that is intended to keep the rain off of you, reality literally warps in a magical effect and way that the rain suddenly beads off of you in like a shell around you, like you had an invisible barrier that blocked just rainfall, nothing else but just the rain. So magic, you can do that. And literally, so reality warps to result in those effects. And as a result of that, I can have magical swords that can chop through anything, because I'm not dealing with material limitations now. I'm dealing literally with supernatural reality warping magic. And yeah, the material will just magically separate for the blade, no matter what material it is, unless it is also magically enhanced with either sunforging or perhaps another magical type of enhancement that is able to resist the imposition, because now this magical blade is imposing reality to separate for its blade. But perhaps there are other magics that can resist that reality warping effect, and it can't chop through other magical materials like that. And maybe if there was an individual that also had a magical enhancement that could resist that, it could also resist the warping effect of the enhancement. So that's what I have done with sun-forged weapons, magical weapons, in my novel, which is Chronicles of Everfall, Shadow of the Conqueror. It's available on Audible, or it's available on Amazon. Audiobooks are available. Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, you can also check that out. And that is one example of what you kind of need to make a sword that can chop, a magical sword that can chop through anything. Do you have any ideas or thoughts of what enchantment or enhancement could achieve that effect? Because remember, if you don't address the fact that really sharp swords would get wedged in, like, you know, steel and stuff like that, what mechanic could you introduce to get the sword that could chop through anything? If Excalibur can chop through a rock, how? How do +1 weapons work according to your kind of interpretation? I'm really interested to hear your comments and thoughts, actually. So share them in the comment section below. And if you want to see magic swords in action, we have our series, Epic Adventure Quest. It's like a mockumentary adventuring group video series. And episode 2, well, I have another enchanted sword that I use in that. You can see it in action. Look, they're a heap of fun. Check it out if you haven't. So click on the video right here and you can go watch Epic Adventures Quest. Not only, but episode 1 is available, but right here. You can check it out. Hope to see you here.